So next up on stage, I think he's just walking past here. We're going to have Patrick Kua. I hope I said that right.
Yeah, that's right.
That was good. That was awesome. I'm getting a hang of this. Next up, I'm trying to learn Romanian names. We'll get around to that eventually. Patrick Kua is from ThoughtWorks. For those of you not familiar, they're pretty much a big thought leader on a lot of very modern software development methodologies, from agile to continuous delivery. And his talk is going to be about continuous delivery, and he's going to introduce us to the secret sauce to innovation. So we're just going to give him a few seconds to get his laptop set up.
Yeah, it's good.
Awesome. I think you're almost there.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'm going to walk off the stage.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Right. So I'm kind of a multitasking person. I do a lot of development. I lead teams. I've written a couple of books around technical leadership. And a lot of the things that we talk about in the sort of day-to-day work with our customers is around continuous delivery. And so a couple of my colleagues have written a book on continuous delivery. How many of you actually would say that you're doing continuous delivery? Okay. It's probably about maybe 15, 20%. What's an interesting thing about CD is it takes a lot more investment than what companies realize if they're going to go down this path. It changes the way that we develop software, changes the way that product people think about software. And one of the challenges that organizations face when they say, we want to do continuous delivery, is they don't understand this investment. And one of the things I want to talk about today is not necessarily about how you go about implementing continuous delivery. There's a book on that. There's lots of tools. There's a lot of people that talk about that. Instead, I want to actually talk to you as developers about how do you sell this to the business? How do you get the business to buy in so that you have the time and sort of the budget to be able to invest in your continuous delivery sort of pipeline and the infrastructure required? And happy to talk outside of this or answer questions at the end about how you go effectively doing the implementation of it. But really, I want to talk about sort of the business side to it and how it supports the business. And this is kind of related into the second book, which is kind of a continuation of continuous delivery, called The Lean Enterprise. And this is really linking the ideas of the capability of what continuous delivery brings to an organization and why everyone should care about it, not just the development side to an organization. And the real key word around this sort of stuff is about the idea of innovation. Now, I've spoken to lots of business people, and that's part of my role as a consultant, which is often sort of convincing business people to invest in continuous delivery, supporting the development side of the organization and bridging them into the business side. And I'm yet to hear somebody in the business say, I don't want innovation. In fact, the biggest thing that I hear from the business side is that my IT capability can't help me innovate enough. And so what's kind of interesting, I guess, is that question about what is innovation. And I think what's really interesting is this idea of we can't actually predict what things are going to be innovative. If we could, we'd be investing them and we'd all be very rich by now. But a lot of the thing is around understanding that a lot of this stuff is unpredictable. And so as we develop software in a faster, rapidly changing world with Internet of Things, with cloud computing, we want to be able to innovate faster and faster. And for me, continuous delivery is the secret sauce to this. And so what does innovation look like? And I want to use a real example that hopefully most of you will understand. Who's familiar with this screenshot? Okay, it's a pretty famous game called Angry Birds, right? And the story behind Angry Birds is really interesting because everyone talks about what an amazing success it is. They've got their own franchise now where they have stuffed toys, where they have a movie. They even have an online sort of TV series with some of the characters from this. And they've really extended, I guess, their sort of marketing around this. But I think the story behind how they innovated this is kind of interesting. I think what a lot of people don't realize with this is that they had done a lot of attempts at making a successful game. So Angry Birds came out around 2009, and Rovio, the company that built this, had been around since about 2003. So for 6 years, they've been writing 50 different games trying to make a hit. And now we know that Angry Birds is maybe an everyday, well-known brand that everyone knows. And I think a lot of people don't understand that innovation takes effort. You have to be willing to sacrifice and fail lots of times in order to be able to do something successful. And even when you're successful, it's very difficult to know if that's going to be successful or not. So this is an interesting message that we need to support our business people, is that, you know, we can't think of a product idea, put all of our sort of investment behind it and assume it's going to be a success. Because we're going to put a lot of different sort of bets down, and only one of them are actually going to pay out. And so the idea behind continuous delivery for me is really thinking about how do we support this. So Werner Vogels is really an interesting, charismatic guy. He writes a letter to his board each year. And one of the things that he talks about is you need to set up and organize so that you can do as many experiments per unit of time per possible. So 6 years, 50 games. Question is, how many experiments, how many bets are we placing in order to be able to do innovation? This guy talks about, he's an economist, and he talks about ideas are useless unless they're actually used. And so, you know, when you go through the whole product cycle around what you end up building, if you're already sort of channeling only one of those ideas out of the 50, there's 49 of those things that kind of go to waste. And this is where maybe the lean startup is actually getting a lot of movement as well. So Eric Ries, who wrote the book on the lean startup, you know, the only way to win is to learn faster than anyone else. And so these are really key messages that we as developers need to be pitching to our business people, and that we want to be able to help the business experiment with their ideas around new features, around new products. And we can't do that if they put a business case for a 6-month piece of work or a 12-month piece of work, and we don't really know what's going to be the result of that work. So what we're trying to do is really support the business in helping them put down lots of bets, helping them run lots of experiments. So what does that actually mean? What we want to do in our software world is, instead of thinking about we're building a single bit of product or we're building a single feature, is that what we're actually doing is building a portfolio of experimentation. So every feature that we build is a theory. We have a theory that this feature will bring in X amount of revenue, or that it'll bring in more customers because of this. And this is the direction that we want to really think about when we're thinking about continuous delivery. So we don't want to sort of build perfect software only to find out that 1% of our users are actually using it. We want to find out the features that our users use and then amplify that feature so that more people get benefit out of it. And in order to do this, we need to change the way that we write software. We need to change the way that we deliver software. And this is where, for me, continuous delivery comes into play. So my question to you, think about your organizations, and I challenge you to ask, how many experiments per year can you actually do? And so maybe you don't actually think about experiments, so maybe let's sort of reword that to, how many releases can you do per year? So who knows this person here? So it's Kent Beck, and he was the original author of XP Explained. And he posed a question to his sort of an audience a while back, asking them the question, how often do you deploy into production? So he's pretty well known, and so he got lots of different responses. And I think it's kind of interesting for you to sort of understand what those results are. And so this was kind of the graph that he put together. So you can kind of see that most people here sort of produce software at least once a week, once a month, and once a quarter, and only a small fraction of the industry are actually producing things faster. And so the approximation of this is around more than 3/4 of our industry only release once per week, or more frequently, or less frequency, rather. And so that's an interesting thing about how many experiments can you run all the time. And so that means that we can only run about 52 maximum experiments per year. But what if we could do that faster and faster and faster? And so I go back to the idea about continuous delivery. And it's not really about which tools you use. It's really about the practice and the principles around this. about reducing the cost, the time, and the risk of delivering incremental changes to users. And this is such a key thing around how do you support the business in experimenting. So one of the biggest challenges that we have with businesses when IT are sort of saying, we want to go to continuous delivery, we want to release more frequently. And the question is, well, how do business people respond? It's like, oh no, that means more risk. We release more things more fast? Ooh, that's not so good. They only think about the bad things that are associated with releasing software. And this is where I actually don't think those two things are in opposition. And one of the things I've learned around helping customers implement continuous delivery in their environments is this idea that it's not really about trade-off of quality and speed. So instead of understanding that it's not around cutting quality in order to get stuff out faster, continuous delivery isn't about that. It's about actually adding these two things in. And so there's an interesting thing where if you actually focus on producing a better continuous delivery pipeline, you'll actually improve your quality and get software out faster and more reliably. So when I talk to organizations about continuous delivery, we often talk about this mantra. If it's painful, we do it more often. Sounds a bit counterintuitive, right? So, our releases, we do 3 times per year. Each one's such a disaster. Let's go back down to 2 per year. That's quite a natural reaction, but it's scary. But actually, what you're doing is accumulating more risk in each of those releases. So the reason that we talk about this, if it's more painful, do it more frequently, is because we want to reduce that pain. So we should be looking at what's causing that pain and trying to remove what's causing those things. So, if it's about stability of software, perhaps we introduce better automated testing. Perhaps we bring in sort of the quality assurance in further into the process where we're sort of test driving our code rather than post-testing our code. Perhaps we actually focus on clarifying what features and what we're going to build before we actually build it. And so there's a lot of consequences that people don't realize until they start off on this journey, is that when you focus on improving quality, you actually improve your speed. And what this means is you can actually experiment much faster, much more reliably, and you can provide the experimentation to the business that they want. So some of these things that characteristic-wise that you typically see in a continuous delivery pipeline is that everything should be controlled. So everything goes under source control in a sort of CD world, so configuration. And I think the trends that we're seeing in our industry is that it's not only just the software that we're building, but also the platforms and infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure as code, the tools like Chef and Puppet that are helping us sort of manage our environments, everything is becoming a lot more controlled. And that improves the quality and the speed at which we can roll out new environments, the speed at which we can scale out to new users. And what's even better about that is when we put them under sort of source control, these things are repeatable. So, we don't have human mistakes causing problems in production. We don't have what we call snowflake servers, which are beautifully handcrafted individual servers, which everyone's afraid to go near because we have no way of reproducing that environment. And the best thing about this stuff is that we can test this stuff in a different environment as well. And so these things help us get speed, because if things are in source control and we have tools to help us automate things, that means we can spin up new environments really fast. I had a really great example of this with a client where we'd come in and we were sort of prototyping a new part of their system, and we wanted to sort of have an environment which was representative of their system, but we didn't want to obviously damage production in terms of what we were sort of playing around with. And so because they had their infrastructure under source control, their application under source control, it only took them a couple of hours to spin up a new environment on AWS, reconfigure a couple of values in terms of which sort of configuration parameters they want, and within hours we had a whole production-like stack where we could do development and rapid prototyping. And based on that, we could actually experiment and get some early feedback on the new product ideas without risking what's happening in production. And if things went well with that, we could actually integrate them back into the mainline and actually sort of test out some of these ideas in real life against real users. And so there's a lot of interesting capabilities that we can unleash and offer to our business when we sort of encourage the practice of continuous delivery. I think the other fear that business people have is often the idea and the confusion between continuous deployment and continuous delivery. And it's kind of interesting, right? So business people will often say, oh, well, I don't want a developer, if they check something in, for that to automatically go into production. And this is where we talk about continuous delivery being a little bit different, in that a change that goes through our sort of continuous delivery pipeline should be going through levels of quality assurance. So we have automated tests that are running at that sort of code level, so our unit tests. We should have automated tests that are running at that acceptance level, so your sort of functional tests or your acceptance tests. You know, if we're even really good, we might even be able to run sort of performance tests and security tests around some of the quality attributes of what we have. And then we have a potential candidate that might go into live. And the biggest difference between continuous deployment and continuous delivery is that the business gets to say what goes live when. So as a development sort of organization, we enable the business to say, here are the candidates of the things that go out with the features that we've built. You get to choose when it goes out. And the great thing about continuous delivery is that it puts that responsibility back on the business. So when the business wants to say we want to release software, it's a controlled manner. So maybe it's just a one-click approval in your sort of continuous delivery pipeline tool. And basically, that then automates the process. And if we're getting there in an ideal world, it just becomes literally a one-click on-demand release from a business side. So IT are no longer the bottleneck to releases. And this does it does an amazing transformation to the relationship between your development group and often where the budget comes from around the business side. Because the business are getting what they want. They get that level of quality that when they release, things aren't going to break. We've put the sort of quality assurance stuff into place. They get to experiment with things. And I know if you're like me, as most developers, it's very satisfying when you actually see your software in production used by end users. You actually connect the things that you've written into actual value and also the impact it's having on end users. And there's nothing more fulfilling than sort of talking to business people and saying, hey, you know, I have an idea about how we might be able to implement something that might get us more users or satisfy our users even better. And so this whole process transforms the relationship between IT and business. There are, of course, lots of different challenges, but that's not really the point of this talk. And we can talk about that another time. So my key message for you is that if you really focus on actually understanding what continuous delivery is, you can use that to sell it to the business as a way of helping them innovate and get you the time so that you can invest in the infrastructure, in the tooling that you need in order to properly implement this. Because that's one of the biggest barriers to adoption, which is where do we find the time when we're busy trying to write features that the business has demanded? And you do need the support and that sort of space and that time so that you can actually focus on building out this, because it's an investment that a lot of companies don't realize they need to go down. And so this brings us on to the idea of innovation and this loop that we call continuous design and continuous delivery. So, rather than thinking about the product as one thing, is that actually we're constantly evolving that product and that platform. And with a lot of the sort of the web and different types of services that are out there, we can actually do this a lot more effectively than what we could when we had sort of everything installed in sort of devices. And I think it'll be a challenge when we talk about the Internet of Things, about how you do this, particularly if you're dependent on different types of hardware profiles. But at least in lots of parts of our software, in our sort of industry, we can actually do this sort of double loop of continuous design, so that means innovation, the experimentation, and then being able to deliver these changes consistently, fastly, repeatably, and safely. Any questions? Can we get a microphone, please?
Okay, so you were talking about doing experiments. When deploying, how would you, if you want to expose some features to a smaller part of the users, let's say, would you do the changes on some feature branches, or would you use some flags and do them on the main branch, or is there a better third way or fourth way of doing this?
So the question around how do you roll out features incrementally and test that? And I think this is an interesting debate about how you do this in terms of what sort of audience do you want to test things on. So Facebook have a model where if you're a Facebook employee, so you have a different role compared to us as public people, they have access to whatever is in development. So they don't really use feature branches as such. Or they do, but it's all automated so that if you're a Facebook employee, you get to see all the sort of new features. So you could do it by role, and you can divide new features based on that. The other thing is around, one interesting thing with continuous delivery is you don't even necessarily need to build feature flags in. You can actually do time box A/B testing. So let's say we build a new feature, let's roll it out there this week. We measure it for a week, and then we might roll back the code, and then release another time. And so that means that our feature's been out there for a week as well. So we're not actually putting flags into production, but we're using the capability of our pipeline because we can release confidently to actually do a time-boxed experiment as well. You could also do feature flags as well, depending on regions and things like that. And I think there's different trade-offs depending on who your users are, what infrastructure and how complex your deployment architecture is. But there's lots of different ways of actually experimenting.
Could you please provide some more details how to manage security in continuous delivery?
Sure. So there's lots of different aspects of security that you need to think about. And I think one of the challenges that you have is what type of security profile that you're looking for. So obviously one of the big things that we hear from customers a lot is it's impossible to do in a financial bank or a financial institute. And I think that's actually false. So Etsy is a SOX compliance company, and they've been doing DevOps, and people have continuous delivery on both sides. And I think a lot of it comes down to how you actually agree on those mechanisms of that. So for instance, in sort of Etsy, developer and operations don't have access to the same environment. So only operations people have access to the infrastructure. But operations people sit within the development team, and they talk really frequently around the tools that they can use to automate. I think another interesting aspect to continuous delivery is that everything should be under source control. So because everything has version control, with your sort of continuous integration or continuous deployment tool, generally you know what logs, who executed which actions. So there's actually a lot more traceability and visibility typically in the sort of CD pipelines that I see, because you can see, okay, such and such triggered this build deployment into this environment. And with the right tools, you can actually say this build is traced back to these sorts of commits, and you know exactly what the differences are between previous ones. So in terms of the security process, I find that it tends to bring a lot more visibility, a lot more predictability, but you have to always work out, depending on your application profile, what's necessary. Does that answer your question? Over here?
I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
How to determine the minimum quality of software to be sold?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
How to determine the minimum quality for software to be sold?
That's a great question. So how do you determine the minimum quality of software to be sold? That's a business question, to be honest.
Sold.
And one of the things that we talk about in the Lean Enterprise thing is actually how do you rapidly prototype and test user ideas? And so a lot of this stuff comes out from the Lean Startup stuff as well, which is when we talk about minimum viable product, it's not really thinking about minimum features. It's actually, there's different dimensions around this, so that you want to have a good user experience, a useful feature that satisfies a need. But what you really want to be doing is sort of not thinking in terms of what physical layers of technical thing, it's actually product features, and that's quite a different shift. But I would definitely recommend reading around the sort of Lean Startup movement, because they've got a lot of things around how you build a proper MVP. But yeah.
In design contain even functionality when you refer on design, continuous design, and
Sorry, can you repeat that?
In continuous design, you consider only how it look?
No, I mean, continuous design requires everyone to consider this. And I think this is the thing with continuous delivery, is that everyone becomes part of the software creation process. Because it's not that we're creating software, but we're all collaboratively creating a product. So our architecture needs to be able to support rapid evolution of things as well. So a lot of the people who do CD need to look at things like emergent design, evolutionary architecture, so that you can defer choices and swap things out. So our software quality needs to be malleable there. But also our user experience, we need to think about what's the minimum and how does that evolve over time as well. So in my experience, to do continuous design effective, it's not just about how it looks, but everyone needs to think about how they help implement that, right? Because the quality of software and the experience of how bug-free or how stable or how fast is a quality attribute our systems need to be able to support as well. So we need to be able to design software so that it meets that experience as well. But it'll be different depending on which industry and who uses your software. I think maybe one more question and then we'll call it a wrap. There was one in the back there.
So the way you present it is like no choice for the business, but can you give us some examples of them coming back and say, okay, these are interesting, but we still have this
sorry, could you speak a bit closer to the mic?
Yeah, sorry.
I get a lot of background from the...
So the way you present it is like it's a no choice for business. You have to choose this because it works. Can you give us some examples of them saying, yes, but... I mean, some other concerns that they chose in face of this option?
Yeah, I mean, typically there are things like budgeting. Yes, but I need to put a business case together to get budget from other things. And also, a lot of this has a lot of things to do with organizational design as well. So typically, sort of operations might be managed separately from development. It depends on the size of your organization. I get this a lot when I work with sort of large companies like banks or financial institutes, governments, or even just long sort of standing traditional firms. So it'll be like, yes, but I don't really understand how we're going to get the skills from other groups to work with us on doing this thing. There's also the what drives people typically as well. So one thing that is a big blocker to adoption with continuous delivery is actually how people get measured in terms of their performance and goals. So, you know, in some organizations, I still see it where, you know, QAs are still measured by how many bugs they find, right? And, you know, yes, but I'd like to be able to do automated testing, but, you know, my job is to find those bugs, not to stop those bugs from actually getting in there. And so there's some of the challenges that I also hear from business people. I think also it requires a level of involvement that some people don't necessarily want. So it's like, what do you mean I have to work with the development team, you know, constantly on a day-to-day basis around saying what I'd like? You know, can't I just say it once and then sort of come back in 2 months and you've written everything perfectly? And this is really helping them understand that experimentation mindset, which is, you know, we can release stuff a lot faster than 2 months because what you think that users might want is going to be quite far away from what actually users need. And so it's actually better for us to get into that scientific method of measuring, you know, what real things are useful, what really earns value from users, and what really triggers that. And I think only with sort of CD and getting that sort of stuff out there is it useful. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.